Hello and welcome to this week's Rights in Russia interview on the situation for human rights defenders in Russia today. I'm Mary Page, and our guest today is Benjamin Nathans, who teaches and writes about Imperial Russia and the Soviet Union, modern European Jewish history, and the history of human rights at the University of Pennsylvania. He is the author and editor of a number of books on Russian history, the history of Russian Jewry and human rights in general, and a regular contributor to the New York Review of Books and an occasional commentator on current Russian affairs. His current book project, To the Success of Our Hopeless Cause, The Many Lives of the Soviet Dissident Movement, tells the story of dissent in the USSR from Stalin's death to the collapse of communism. Thank you for joining us, Ben, and sharing your thoughts and comments.
Thank you.
I have a series of questions to structure our half hour together. So if you're ready, let's get started.
Please.
As someone who studies human rights in the Soviet period, how do you explain the sudden support for improved human rights among politicians and the general public in the Gorbachev period?
Well, I would begin by saying that I'm not sure it was so sudden. There was a tradition in the Soviet Union of support for their version of human rights. And in fact, going back to the 1930s, the Soviets were convinced that they had a superior and more genuine regime of rights than the West, because the government didn't just promise not to interfere in speech and assembly, but to provide the material basis for free speech and free assembly. That at least was the theory on paper in the various Soviet constitutions. And the Soviet state really never ceased to brag about the superior quality of their rights regime versus that of the West. So the language was there all along, but of course there was an enormous gap between what was promised on paper and what was practiced in reality. I think, though, that there was a spike of interest and support for human rights in the second half of the 1980s, when Gorbachev became General Secretary of the Communist Party. And I think part of that is simply that there was a sense of intellectual bankruptcy with Marxism, and human rights presented themselves as a new moral language, a new form of moral reasoning, politically relevant moral reasoning that can be embraced by anyone. It was very hard to come out against human rights beginning in the 1970s because of the increasing prominence that they had globally. But I wouldn't say it came out of nowhere in the late Soviet case.
And how would you assess the human rights record under President Yeltsin?
Well, when we talk about President Yeltsin, we're talking largely about the 1990s, the period immediately after the Soviet collapse in December of '91, until Yeltsin decided to leave the stage and appoint Putin at the very end of 1999. So I think it's important to remember that human rights is a very broad category. It includes the sort of classic human rights dealing with freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of private property. And those rights are generally aimed at placing constraints on the state and what the state can do to individual citizens. Because historically, the greatest abuse of human rights has come at the hands of states in the most extreme form of genocide or mass murder. But human rights for a long time have included other domains, including social and economic rights, which are not about the state refraining from interfering in the lives of individual citizens, but about obligations that the state has to create a certain safety net for its citizens, whether that's in the form of free healthcare, free education, free or subsidized housing. So to answer your question, what happened to human rights in the 1990s in the Soviet Union under Yeltsin was extremely variegated. There had never been a period of greater freedom of speech and freedom of assembly in the 20th century in Russia. So on that front, it was a period of enormous expansion of people's rights of expression in all formats. But in the domain of social and economic rights, it was for the majority of the Soviet population a catastrophe, because the social safety net that the Soviet Union had constructed over the decades, with all its strengths and weaknesses, but that net virtually disappeared. And people's sense of security about where the next meal was going to come from, guaranteed employment, subsidized housing, all of this began to slip out of their grasp. So it's an extremely varied picture. And it's impossible to say, it was better, it was worse. In some areas, it was much better. And in other areas, it was much worse. And just as a footnote to the better part, to what happened to freedom of speech in the 1990s, I mean, I spent several years living in Russia off and on in the 1990s. And one of the things that emerged under the new virtually uncensored public sphere was a lot of pornography. And this upset a lot of Russians to see pornography being sold in kiosks on the streets of virtually every major city. So even in that domain, if you asked Russians, they would have, I think, given you a mixed answer.
So under President Putin, now thinking about how the Western press characterizes what's going on with human rights in Russia, and I hope maybe you can speak to both civil and political and social and economic rights. But the picture is very gloomy now that is painted for readers in this country. So do you think that it's a fair picture?
Well, my sense of the Western coverage of Russia, not only under Putin, but historically, is that it tends to focus more on negative trends than positive trends. It tends to be more critical, but there is ample room for criticism, especially now, and especially in the past few years. The human rights situation in Russia really is gloomy, and I'll be happy to go into some detail in the different arenas that we've been discussing so far. Up until a couple of years ago, there were clear signs that the Kremlin wanted to take over control of mass media, above all of television. And under Putin, it has systematically taken over and essentially colonized the television industry, especially the television news industry in Russia, such that it's almost impossible to watch any TV news reporting and get a remotely balanced take on Russian politics these days. But up until very recently, the internet, and Russians are generally highly technically literate. They have a very high proportion of internet and social media users, and that whole arena remained virtually uncensored. You could pretty much read and post anything you wanted, with the exception of the usual caveats about threatening politicians or threatening violence. But the political spectrum was wide open on the internet. It really was a very free space, and tens of millions of Russians were getting a daily alternative to what their TV stations were telling them. TV never stopped being the leading source of news information for Russia, but for any Russians with a cell phone or a laptop, the internet was available. That is now starting to change. And the signs of that starting to change go back at least 2 or 3 years. Putin wants to establish what he calls a sovereign Russian internet, which, as far as I understand, seeks to replicate the Great Firewall in China, where the internet space in China will be controlled by the government, is controlled by the government. And the Kremlin is making similar moves to control the servers of foreign companies like Twitter and Facebook that are stationed in Russia, and to slowly transform the Russian internet into something that looks much more like Russian TV. The most glaring violations of human rights in Russia, though, are the treatment of people who I think we can once again fairly call dissidents. And some of them are now political prisoners. The number of journalists who've been assassinated in Russia over the last 20 years is really quite shocking. And in only a handful of cases has any serious criminal prosecution followed those assassinations. Many of those cases remain unresolved. And there's good reason to think that that's not an accident, that the government is happy to have them unresolved, even if it's difficult in many cases to point accurately at who the actual perpetrators are. So investigative journalists work under a system of mortal threat, really of very concrete threats to their lives. And of course, for every journalist, investigative journalist who's killed, there are 10 or 100 others who are so shaken by this record of assassinating journalists that they don't do the stories that they otherwise would like to. So the intimidation factor is in some ways numerically more significant than the number of people who've been killed. And people who are seeking to exercise their political rights by forming opposition parties and running for elections also face very serious intimidation, including arrest and imprisonment, the most famous case being Alexei Navalny, but he's not the only one, to the point where we now have a reliable sense of there being hundreds of political prisoners in Russia. So people's political rights, their right to exercise choice under a democratic system, are significantly curtailed. As regards social and economic rights, Putin presided over a dramatic turnaround in the health of the Russian economy. He was assisted by a rising tide of oil and gas prices on the world market, which dramatically raised the revenues of those industries in Russia. And he also returned control over oil and natural gas, as well as precious metals, either directly to the state or to companies that were de facto controlled by the state. So I wouldn't say he fully renationalized those key industries, but he brought them under the aegis of the Kremlin, and therefore enormous revenues flowed to the government, which allowed a significant recovery from the economic freefall of the 1990s. He did not really reinstate anything resembling the social safety net that existed in the Soviet era. But what he did do, or what the economy made possible, was the gradual emergence of a middle class, the rise of people out of poverty. And that's a process that is continuing slowly. Obviously, Western economic sanctions haven't helped it. And the dramatic drop in prices of oil and gas up until this year really didn't help it, because it reduced the money that the government had to spend. So nothing as dramatic as what the Chinese government did it has happened in Russia. You know, the Chinese government raised hundreds of millions of people from poverty. That's not the case in Russia. And Russia is still comparatively a poor country. It's a petro state. It's a state that relies very, very heavily on export of the raw goods that it happens to have on its territory. So I wouldn't say that the social safety net has been restored, but the sense of desperation and people needing to hold 2 or 3 jobs just to survive that characterized the 1990s is really not very much the case anymore.
Mm-hmm. If you were to talk to just ordinary citizens, people in the street, about their main concern, their main human rights concern, first of all, do people think about human rights? And secondly, what do you think that would be?
There's clearly a small minority of people in Russia, especially in the big cities, Moscow, St. Petersburg, above all, for whom human rights are a meaningful concept, something they care about, something that they can articulate their thoughts on. But my impression is that in general, in the Russian population, human rights are not a serious factor in people's thinking about society and politics and the state. In fact, I think the majority of Russians, maybe even the overwhelming majority of Russians, think that politics is a dirty business in which they would simply rather not become involved, that it's highly corrupt, and that it involves treating people in ways that violate the ethical norms that we have in our daily interactions with friends and relatives and neighbors. So the lack of political engagement in the Russian population, I think, more often than not, translates into, if not outright indifference to human rights, then a fairly low level of interest. And I think, especially in the provinces where the standard of living is significantly lower than in the big cities, I think people's concerns, and this is not unique to Russia, are largely about their material well-being, quality of life issues, housing, education, healthcare, etc. I don't think human rights as a concept resonates very widely and very deeply in Russia today. Again, apart from the small minority of people who are more politically active, who protest, and who have access to sources of news other than television.
Mm-hmm. So going back to the subject of dissidence, which you have written on extensively, one of the worst aspects of the Soviet regime was the abuse of psychiatry and the incarceration of dissidents in political hospitals. There are indications that this might be returning. For example, in the case of Alexander Gabyshev, the shaman from Siberia, who's tried to walk across Russia to Moscow to, quote, rid the country of President Putin, as he put it. So why did the Soviet authorities use this particularly inhumane form of treatment to combat dissent? And do you think we might see the practice return in Russia today?
Yeah, it's a really interesting and troubling question. If you go back far enough in Soviet history, which means to the Stalin era of the 1930s and 40s, putting arrested people in psychiatric institutions was actually regarded by many, including the arrestees themselves, as a merciful gesture, because the alternative was to be sent to the gulag or executed, with or without something resembling a trial. And being put in a psychiatric facility, as horrible and unpleasant as that was a way to survive in an era when millions of people were killed by their own government. By the 1960s and 70s, that has ceased to be the case, in part because the carceral system is less lethal under Stalin's descendants, people like Khrushchev and Brezhnev, and also because the imprisonment or confinement in psychiatric institutions in the 60s and 70s now involves being injected with psychotropic drugs, mind-altering drugs. So the consequences of being in a psychiatric prison or hospital are really much more serious. The main reason why the Soviet state resorts to that technique against dissidents, and the numbers are probably somewhere between 500 and 1,000 total who are subject to that treatment. We still don't know exactly. But the reason why the state had recourse to that technique was in most cases to avoid putting people on trial. Trials created too much negative publicity, both among dissidents in the Soviet Union, but more importantly in the West, because sooner or later information got out. And I say that even though 99.9% of political trials under the Soviet regime ended with convictions, the desired outcome as far as the state was concerned, the publicity from the trial was almost always a disaster for the state. It made the state look very bad. So if you put someone in a psychiatric institution, there doesn't need to be any publicity. There doesn't need to be a trial. There doesn't need to be anything beyond an arrest and a determination by a single psychiatrist who may be an employee of the KGB that this person is mentally unfit to stand trial and therefore should be sent to a psychiatric institution. And furthermore, there's never a legal limit on the amount of time that the person can be kept in such an institution. It's entirely at the discretion of the doctors. So it's a stealth method of silencing people who, if they were put on trial in a courtroom, might create a lot of bad press for the government. If we fast forward to today, the case that you mentioned of the shaman making his way to Moscow is very troubling. I don't see it as yet a large-scale phenomenon. The Kremlin has become very skillful, even more skillful than its Soviet predecessors, at using the law and the legal system, which is not really independent of the government, of using that system to silence or at least temporarily shuttle troublemakers into the prison system. So take Alexei Navalny, for example. He has been put on trial for many, many alleged violations, financial misdeeds, failing to get a permit for a demonstration. There seems to be no end to the list of technicalities that the Kremlin can cook up to put people in prison without having to address the real issue, which is their political stance and their commitment to a different kind of politics. So to date, the Russian government has not really had to rely in any significant degree on psychiatric institutions because it is more or less able to accomplish what it wants to do using the legal system. And where that doesn't work, they kill people, they assassinate people. It sounds strange to say this, but the Soviet government after Stalin almost never killed dissidents. It was extremely rare. And when it happened, it was usually people who were in the camps and who either died from malnutrition or disease, or they declared a hunger strike and the hunger strike killed them. There were cases of botched operations on sick inmates, dissident inmates in prisons and labor camps, but people were not being killed on the streets. There were not assassinations the way we've seen in the last 10 or 15 years in Russia. So it's a new regime that we're dealing with.
Thank you. So thinking about the history of dissent and what it might mean for people in Russia today, do you think that it's relevant to Russian citizens right now?
Well, if you're asking me whether I think it's relevant, absolutely.
Yeah.
This is a very important strand of Russian and Soviet history that I think is enormously informative and worth reflecting on. But I think your question is really whether Russians think it's relevant today.
Right.
And here again, I would sort of give a two-part answer, and I'll try to be brief. For those who are politically active in the sense of wanting to reform Russian state practices, I see a lot of awareness and knowledge of the dissident movement, down to the level of specific individuals, specific texts, and specific ideas about what needs to be done. As far as the ideas go, the thinking of people like Andrei Sakharov is still very much alive among reformers today in Russia. And since we're talking about human rights, I think the single greatest idea that Sakharov came up with was that human rights were not just a way of making states behave better. Human rights, insofar as they deal with things like freedom of information and freedom of speech, are in the long run actually tools towards more effective governance. Mm-hmm. Modern states need free flow of information in order to come to informed decisions about very complex social issues. So the free flow of information and the free expression of ideas, of criticism, of innovation is fundamental for modern good governance. It's not just something you do to be nice and ethical. It's actually part of being an effective state vis-a-vis the population that you're governing. And I think that idea that Sakharov developed, and he also made connections between honoring human rights domestically and international behavior, that's a really important part of Russia's intellectual history. And there are other dissidents who have served as models or icons for protesters today. But the polling data, and I mean data from very respected public opinion organizations like the Levada Center in Moscow, which is the leading source of information about what Russians think about any topic under the sun. The polling data suggests that most Russians know very little about the history of the Soviet dissident movement. The majority of Russians struggle to name even a single person who was part of that movement. Usually the best you can hope for is that they've heard of either Andrei Sakharov or Alexander Solzhenitsyn, both of whom produced extraordinary achievements before they became dissidents. That is, Solzhenitsyn, was a world-class writer. Sakharov was a world-class theoretical physicist who helped design important parts of the Soviet nuclear arsenal. So these are, and both won the Nobel Prize, one for literature, one for peace. So these are people whose reputations would be enormous, even apart from their role as dissidents. But beyond those two, it's I think knowledge in general in Russia today of the history of the dissident movement is pretty thin. For a while, the dissidents were heroes because they were seen as having helped bring down the Soviet Union. And then they became villains for the same reason, because they brought down the Soviet Union and this glorious, powerful, enormous country that had been dismembered in 1991. That for the first 10 years after the Soviet Union collapsed, the dissidents' reputation was like a roller coaster, up and down and up and down. Now I think it's largely faded from most people's attention, except those who are active in the protest movements and who are conscious that they are part of a lineage.
In your view, what should the US, the EU, Western countries in general do to support human rights in Russia? Is there anything, or should they be hands off?
There are things that can be done, but we need to have a sober, realistic understanding of the limits of what Western governments and Western organizations can do. And I deliberately say both governments and organizations, because after all, a huge chunk of work in the domain of human rights is done by NGOs, organizations that are not affiliated with governments and states, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and many, many others. The attitude of the Russian government toward NGOs is entirely cynical. They regard these organizations as just lightly camouflaged arms of Western states, Western policy, maybe even Western organizations. And that's a tradition that goes back to the Soviet era, when we saw the same attitudes. I really don't know the extent to which that cynical view of human rights NGOs is shared by the Russian population. The government has taken enormous steps to tarnish the reputation of non-governmental organizations, whether they are Russian or foreign, especially with the creation roughly a decade ago of this law about foreign agents. So NGOs that receive funding from abroad are obliged, if they're going to continue receiving that funding, to officially register as foreign agents. And in Russia, the term иностранный агент is basically a synonym for spy. So it is a black mark on any organization that registers on that list, and there are hundreds now on that list. It serves as a damper on soliciting funds from potential Russian donors. So even if they try to wean themselves from foreign funding by turning to Russian oligarchs who wants to go on record as having donated to an organization that is officially a foreign agent? And this is one of several techniques that the Russian state has used to stigmatize the building blocks of civil society. And with the current attack, literally this week and next, on the leading human rights organization in Russia, that traces its history back to the late Soviet era. It's now over 3 decades old, formally established in 1989 when Gorbachev was still premier. I'm talking, of course, about Memorial. Now Memorial faces the threat of being shut down for alleged violations of the foreign agent law. And I just want to, if you'll permit me, I just want to take a minute to describe what those allegations are. One of the stipulations of being officially registered as a foreign agent is that you have to identify yourself as such on every single document that you produce. If you publish a book, the organization has to be identified as a foreign agent. If you have a website, it has to say foreign agent. Everything has to be labeled so that the branding is there in the most ubiquitous fashion possible. What the state prosecutor is accusing Memorial of having done is failed to label some of its products with that stigmatizing name. And it turns out that what they have in mind are several pages within the Memorial website. Now you can imagine a website could have 1,000 different pages. They also point to some publications that Memorial released that don't identify it as a foreign agent. It turns out those publications predate the law on foreign agents, or predate the moment when Memorial capitulated and agreed to describe itself as such. So these are cooked up charges. Some of them may be true. Maybe there are some pages within the website that don't have the word foreign agent on them. But the idea that that could translate into a demand to liquidate the organization is absurd. And it's a clear sign that this is a political vendetta against Memorial because of the human rights work that it does, both historical, about the victims of state repression under Stalin and later, or contemporary in Memorial's exposure of violation of human rights within Russia. And both of these arenas of work are the raison d'etre of that organization.
So in this context, what's your view of the future of human rights in Russia?
At this moment, in the middle of November 2021, things look grim. Memorial really is the flagship human rights organization in Russia. And if this lawsuit succeeds in shutting down the organization, including its unique archive of documents from the Soviet period, that is a very, very worrisome sign. And one of the reasons why so many reform-minded Russians have been rallying around Memorial and demanding that the case be dropped is that they recognize that this will be a watershed. If Memorial is shut down, then no civil society organization, no NGO is safe in Russia if Memorial can be taken down. So the short term looks grim. And I don't think the mid to long term will start to look brighter unless a larger proportion of the Russian population starts to consider human rights as a critical political agenda. Until that happens, I really don't see much room for progress. And you asked me earlier what Western countries can do, or Western organizations can do. Even though today's Russian rulers care less about Western opinion than their Soviet predecessors did, turns out their Soviet predecessors were very sensitive to criticism from the West. We know this without a shadow of a doubt from the archival record. Those who rule Russia today are simply, if not indifferent, then they really don't care what the West says. Nonetheless, I think Western governments, prominent people, NGOs need to continue to speak out about the most egregious violations of human rights in the Soviet Union. The European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg needs to continue receiving and hearing and adjudicating cases from Russia, which is still a member of that organization. So we need to keep the oxygen of publicity flowing so that accounts of violations get out and the appropriate protests are lodged. But in the long run, it's really only the Russian electorate that can fundamentally change the situation.
All right, and on this note, which is a call to action and a rather negative view of how things are in Russia, the way that you see them in the next, at least in the short term, I'm afraid we've come to the end of our time together. But thank you so much for spending this time with Rights in Russia and for sharing your insights on the situation for human rights defenders in Russia today and the historical antecedents to those defenders. Best wishes for the coming holidays, and we look forward to your book when it comes out. Thank you again, Ben, for joining Rights in Russia.
Thank you for having me.